There is a place in Russia where the ground itself is frozen. Not for a season, not for a winter, for thousands of years. In some regions, the cold reaches more than 1,000 meters straight down beneath the surface. Entire forests grow on top of it. Entire cities stand on top of it. Rivers freeze so deeply that trucks drive across them like highways. And in the coldest inhabited place on Earth, the air can drop below -70 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to freeze your breath before it even leaves your mouth. Cold enough that metal cracks like glass. Cold enough that the ground refuses to thaw, even in summer. And yet, people live here, not a few. Not in isolation, millions of them. Across a territory so vast that if Siberia were its own country, it would be the largest on Earth. Larger than Canada, larger than the United States, larger than all of Europe combined. This is not the empty wilderness most people imagine. It is something else entirely. A frozen world hiding behind one of the most misunderstood regions on the planet. And the deeper you go, the less it resembles anything you thought you knew about Russia. From the outside, Siberia is often reduced to one idea: cold, empty, distant, a blank space on the map, a punishment, a prison, a void. But that version doesn't survive contact with the real place, because Siberia is not one landscape. It is dozens, stacked side by side across nearly 5 million square miles. It contains the deepest lake in the world, holding 1/5 of all the unfrozen freshwater on Earth. It contains volcanoes that erupt against snow. It contains forests so vast they produce a measurable share of the planet's oxygen. It contains entire peoples whose languages, beliefs, and survival systems existed long before Russia reached this far east. And it contains something stranger still. A relationship between humans and extreme cold that exists almost nowhere else on the planet. To understand Siberia, you cannot start with politics. You have to start with the land. Because here, the land is not a backdrop. It is the story. And the first thing it teaches you is that everything you thought was solid isn't. Segment 1. The ground that never thaws. Walk into a forest in central Siberia in the middle of summer. The air is warm. Mosquitoes hover above the moss. Wildflowers open across the clearings. Birds move through the canopy. Then dig. Push past the soft top layer of soil. Go down a few inches, a foot, 2 feet, and suddenly the shovel stops. Not on rock, on ice. This is permafrost, ground that has been frozen continuously for at least 2 consecutive years, and in much of Siberia for tens of thousands of years. It covers nearly 2/3 of Russia. In some places, it reaches more than 1,400 meters deep, almost a mile of frozen earth beneath your feet. And it changes everything, because permafrost is not just cold ground. It is what holds the land together. It supports buildings, roads, pipelines, runways, entire cities. Which is why in Siberian towns built on permafrost, you see something strange. Buildings stand on stilts, not for flooding, not for design, because if a heated building sits directly on frozen earth, it melts the ice beneath it. The ground softens, the structure tilts, walls crack, foundations fail. So the buildings are lifted. Cold air is allowed to circulate underneath, keeping the ground frozen and the structure stable. It's a small detail, but it tells you everything about how this place works. Because here, the architecture doesn't shape the land dictates the architecture. And then there are the things the permafrost holds. Frozen for millennia, this ground has preserved entire ecosystems from another age. Mammoth tusks emerge from riverbanks every spring as the soft surface erodes. Complete carcasses, wool, skin, muscle, organs have been pulled from the ice, so well preserved that scientists have studied their last meals. Some of these animals last walked the earth more than 30,000 years ago, and they are still here, not as fossils, as bodies. The permafrost is a vault, a frozen archive of a vanished world, holding species that disappeared before written history began. But this archive is no longer stable, because as the climate shifts, the permafrost is beginning to thaw, and as it thaws, the ground starts to behave in ways no one planned for. Roads sink, pipelines bend, buildings tilt, lakes appear where solid land used to be. In some regions, the surface collapses into vast craters. Sinkholes hundreds of meters wide, opening without warning, releasing gases trapped underground for thousands of years. Locals call them the doors to the underworld. And they are growing. The largest of them, the Baikal crater, expands by tens of meters every year, exposing layers of soil, ice, and ancient organic matter that have been hidden since long before human civilization began. It is one of the clearest visible signs that this frozen world is changing. And it raises a question that defines everything north of here. If the ground itself is no longer stable, what is? Because just beyond these forests, there is a place where the cold is no longer a feature of the landscape. It is the entire reality of it. Segment 2. The coldest inhabited place on Earth. The road to Oymyakon doesn't feel like a road. It feels like a corridor cut through a frozen world that was never meant to be crossed. In winter, the temperature here can drop below minus 60 degrees Celsius. The lowest reliably recorded temperature in an inhabited place on Earth was measured here, close to minus 70, not in a research station. In a village, where people live, where children go to school, where shops open in the morning. Oymyakon sits in a valley in the Republic of Sakha, deep in eastern Siberia. About 500 people call it home, and everything about their daily life is shaped by the cold. Cars cannot be turned off in winter. If you stop the engine, the oil freezes, the battery dies, the fuel line seizes. So engines are left running for hours, sometimes days. Some residents keep their vehicles in heated garages that look more like small bunkers. Pens don't work, ink freezes, glasses freeze to your face. Eyelashes turn white within seconds of stepping outside. If you exhale through a scarf, the moisture in your breath freezes against the fabric and forms a solid sheet of ice across your mouth. And the ground is so hard that burying the dead in winter requires building fires for days to soften the soil enough to dig. These are not exaggerations. These are the routine logistics of a place that exists at the absolute edge of what human biology can tolerate. And yet, life continues. Children walk to school until the temperature drops below minus 52. Below that, classes are canceled. Above it, they are not. Markets sell frozen fish stacked like firewood, hardened so completely that they don't need refrigeration. They are sold by the piece, standing upright in the snow. Horses graze outside in temperatures that would kill almost any other large mammal. The Yakutian horse, native to this region, has evolved a coat thick enough and a metabolism slow enough to survive the open winter without shelter. Reindeer herders move across the surrounding land, following routes their families have used for generations. Nothing about this is improvised. Everything is inherited. Knowledge of which wines carry the deepest cold, which days are safe to travel, how to read the sky, how to dress, how to move, how to stop, how to survive. Outsiders see Oymyakon as impossible. The people who live here see it as home. And that distinction matters, because Siberia is full of places that look uninhabitable from the outside and yet contain entire communities who understand them in ways no map can show. The cold did not push people out. It selected who stayed. And those who stayed built a relationship with the environment that doesn't translate easily into anything else. But Oymyakon is only one extreme. Because not far from here, the landscape changes again. The cold remains, but the ground beneath it opens. Segment 3. The lake that holds a fifth of the world's fresh water. In the south of Siberia, the land curves inward and drops. And inside that drop sits something that does not behave like a lake. Lake Baikal is the deepest lake on Earth. More than 1,600 meters from surface to floor. Old enough, about 25 million years, to be considered the oldest lake in the world, and vast enough to hold roughly 1/5 of all the unfrozen freshwater on the planet's surface. One lake, 20% of the world's accessible fresh water. Standing on its shore, you cannot see the far side. The horizon ends in water, the way it does at sea. Waves move across it, storms form over it, ships cross it for days. But Baikal is not the sea. It is something stranger. In winter, the entire surface freezes, and not in the way most lakes freeze, with rough ice, broken patches, opaque white. Baikal freezes into sheets of ice so clear you can see straight through them, down into the dark blue depths below. Walk across it and the ground beneath your feet looks like glass. Cracks form in patterns that stretch for hundreds of meters. Air bubbles, trapped during the freezing process, sit suspended at different depths like frozen punctuation. In some places, methane rising from the lakebed is captured mid-ascent, creating columns of bubbles locked in clear ice, a kind of accidental sculpture made entirely by physics. When the ice contracts in the cold, it produces sounds. Long, deep cracks that travel across the surface like distant gunfire. Low moans that seem to come from beneath your feet. Sharp snaps that echo off the surrounding mountains. The lake speaks. And then there is what lives in it. Baikal contains thousands of species, and most of them exist nowhere else on Earth. Among them is the Baikal seal, the only freshwater seal species in the world. How its ancestors arrived here, hundreds of miles from any ocean, is still not fully understood. The leading theory is that they migrated upriver from the Arctic millions of years ago and adapted to a freshwater environment that has remained isolated ever since. There are also fish that live exclusively in the deepest layers of the lake, adapted to pressures and temperatures that would kill almost anything else. Baikal is not just a body of water. It is a closed ecosystem that has evolved in isolation for so long that it has produced its own version of life. And around this lake, indigenous communities, particularly the Buryat people, like Kyrgyzstan, have lived for centuries, treating the lake not as a resource, but as a presence. In their traditions, Baikal is sacred. Certain shores are considered places of spirit. Certain rituals still take place at the water's edge during specific times of year. This relationship is older than Russia, older than most of what we call history, and it continues because Baikal, like Oymyakon, like the permafrost forests, exists inside a version of Siberia that the outside world rarely sees. A version where the land is alive in a literal sense, where water holds memory, where ice holds sound, where survival is not an exception, but a tradition. But even Baikal, with all its scale, is not the strangest thing this region contains. Because if you keep moving east, past the lake, past the taiga, past the last roads, you reach a peninsula where the ground stops being frozen and starts burning. Segment 4. Where fire meets ice. The Kamchatka Peninsula extends from the eastern edge of Siberia like a long, narrow arm reaching into the Pacific. It is one of the most remote inhabited regions on Earth. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of Russia. To reach it, you fly, or you sail. And when you arrive, the landscape doesn't match anything you've seen so far, because Kamchatka is on fire. More than 300 volcanoes rise across the peninsula. At least 29 of them are still active. Some erupt every few years. Some erupt every few months. A few are in a near-constant state of activity, releasing steam, ash, and lava into a sky that, for much of the year, is filled with snow. This is where two of the strongest forces on the planet collide. Geological heat from below, Arctic cold from above, and neither one wins. Volcanoes here rise straight out of glaciers. Lava flows down slopes covered in snow. Hot springs steam in valleys where the air temperature is well below freezing. Bears wade through rivers fed by both meltwater and geothermal vents. The contrast is not subtle. It is the entire identity of the place. The Valley of Geysers, one of only a handful of major geyser fields in the world, sits inside a volcanic caldera in the middle of Kamchatka. Hundreds of thermal features release boiling water and steam into the cold air. The result is a landscape that looks more like another planet than another country. And the wildlife matches the strangeness of the geology. Kamchatka has one of the highest densities of brown bears in the world. They feed on salmon during the summer runs, when rivers fill so densely with fish that the water itself seems to move. Sea eagles, among the largest in the world, nest along the coasts. Volcanic ash enriches the soil, making certain valleys unexpectedly fertile despite the latitude. People live here too. Not many, but enough to sustain communities, ports, and traditions. The indigenous peoples of Kamchatka, the Itelmen, the Koryaks, the Even, have lived on this peninsula for thousands of years. Long before Russian explorers reached the region in the 17th century, these communities had developed deep knowledge of the volcanoes, the salmon runs, the bear movements, the weather patterns. Their relationship with the land is not romantic. It is practical. In a place where the ground can shake without warning and the weather can shift in minutes, that knowledge is not optional. It is the difference between survival and disappearance. And Kamchatka, like the rest of Siberia, is not a place where the human story is separate from the geological one. The two are written into each other. But Siberia is not only about extremes of cold and fire. It is also about people. And the deeper you look at who actually lives across these vast distances, the more the simplified image of Siberia falls apart. Segment 5. The peoples before Russia. Long before the word Russia reached this far east, Siberia was already inhabited. Not by a single culture, by dozens. The Yakuts, the Evenki, the Buryats, the Chukchi, the Nenets, the Khanty, the Mansi, the Tuvans, the Itelmen, the Koryaks, the Dolgan, the Selkup, and many more, each with their own language, their own beliefs, their own ways of moving across the land. Some were reindeer herders who followed the same migration routes for generations, living in portable tents made of wood and hide that could be assembled and dismantled in hours. Some were river peoples who built their lives around fishing, ice, and the seasonal rhythms of frozen waterways. Some were horse-based cultures of the southern steppes, whose writing traditions stretched back to the deep history of Central Asia. Some practiced shamanism, not as folklore, but as a working spiritual system with healers, rituals, and an understanding of the natural world that treated rivers, mountains, animals, and weather as conscious participants in human life. In Tuva, in southern Siberia, throat singing developed as a vocal tradition in which a single human voice produces multiple tones at once, low fundamentals layered with high harmonics. It is unlike almost any other vocal style in the world. It evolved in a landscape of vast open space where sound carries differently and voices were shaped to match the geography. Among the Nenets in the Arctic North, reindeer herding remains a living tradition today. Families still migrate across the tundra following their herds, using sledges, tents, and knowledge passed down across generations. Some children learn to handle reindeer before they learn to read. These cultures were not erased by the arrival of Russian settlers in the 16th and 17th centuries. They were pressured. They were transformed. Some were nearly destroyed, but many endured. And today, across Siberia, indigenous languages, religious practices, and traditional skills still exist, not as museum displays, but as parts of daily life in regions where nothing else would work. Because the knowledge these peoples carry is not interchangeable with modern technology. A GPS will not tell you which patch of snow is safe to cross. A weather app will not warn you about a wind that locals recognize from the way the air smells. A textbook will not teach you how to read the behavior of a reindeer herd before a storm. That knowledge exists only inside the cultures that developed it, and in Siberia, that knowledge is still being used. This is one of the things outsiders almost never see when they think of Russia. Siberia is not a Russian wilderness with a few scattered villages. It is a vast region of overlapping civilizations, where the dominant culture is recent and the older cultures are still here, quieter, more dispersed, but unmistakably present. And once you understand that, the entire image of Siberia begins to shift. It is no longer a void. It is a layered, populated, deeply human landscape that happens to be wrapped in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. But there is one more layer to this story, because beyond the cold, the fire, and the cultures, there is the simple fact of how vast this place actually is. And vastness here is not a number. It is an experience. Segment 6. The scale that doesn't fit on a map. Try to picture Siberia honestly, and the mind fails. It stretches across 8 time zones. From the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, it covers roughly 13 million square kilometers. Close to 10% of the entire land surface of the planet. If Siberia were independent, it would be the largest country on Earth by a wide margin, and almost all of that space is forest, tundra, mountain, river, or ice. The taiga, the vast boreal forest that covers much of central and northern Siberia, is the largest forest on Earth. Larger than the Amazon. It contains more trees than any other ecosystem on the planet. Pine, spruce, larch, and birch extend across distances so vast that the same forest crosses entire time zones without significant change. Inside this forest, you can travel for days without seeing another human being. Not because Siberia is empty, because the scale absorbs people. A village of 2,000 might be the only settlement for 100 kilometers in any direction. A regional capital might sit alone in the middle of a territory the size of a European country. Distances here are measured differently. A nearby town might be 6 hours away by car, when the road exists. In winter, Some roads are only passable when the rivers freeze hard enough to drive across. These are called zimniks, winter roads, temporary highways that exist only a few months a year and disappear when the ice melts. Entire industries rely on them. Fuel deliveries, food shipments, construction supplies, all timed to the freezing of the rivers. When the ice goes, the roads go with it, and the communities they serve become reachable only by helicopter, boat, or not at all. This is the rhythm of life across much of Siberia, not the rhythm of cities where time is measured in minutes. The rhythm of seasons, where time is measured by what the land allows. And inside this immensity, the Trans-Siberian Railway runs like a thin line of human determination across the continent. More than 9,000 kilometers from Moscow to Vladivostok, the longest railway line in the world. A journey that takes 7 days without stopping. Riding it is not just transportation, it is a lesson in scale. You wake up. The landscape outside the window is forest. You sleep. You wake up again. The landscape is still forest. You eat. You read. You sleep. You wake up. The landscape has changed, but only slightly. Birch instead of pine. A river instead of a hill. A village instead of an open field. Days pass. The forest continues. And slowly, the meaning of the word vast stops being abstract. It becomes something you feel in your body. This is what no map can show. The sheer, almost unreasonable size of the place. The way it dwarfs human plans. The way it forces patience. The way it makes every human structure, every road, every village, every railway, feel like a single thread inside an enormous fabric. Siberia is not big the way countries are big. It is big the way oceans are big. And living inside it changes how you think about what humans can and cannot control. Siberia is one of the most misunderstood regions on Earth. Not because it is hidden, because it is so often reduced to a single idea. Cold, empty, distant, punishing, but that version doesn't survive contact with the real place. Because Siberia is not empty. It contains millions of people, dozens of cultures and traditions older than most of what we call history. It is not uniform. It contains the deepest lake on the planet, the coldest inhabited village on the planet, volcanoes that erupt against snow, forests that produce a measurable share of the world's oxygen, and ground frozen so deeply that mammoths still emerge from it. It is not silent. It contains throat singers, shamans, reindeer herders, and the cracking of ice that carries for kilometers across frozen lakes. It is not a void. It is a layered, populated, deeply ancient world that happens to exist inside one of the most extreme environments on Earth. And once you see it that way, the headlines don't fit anymore, because Siberia is not a story about cold. It is a story about endurance, about what humans, animals, and entire cultures can build when the environment refuses to forgive mistakes. About what survives when nothing else does. About what the world looks like in places where the simplest things, drinking water, walking outside, burying the dead, require knowledge that took generations to develop. This is the Siberia that exists behind the mystery, not the wasteland of imagination, but a frozen world that holds more life, more history, and more depth than almost anywhere else on the planet. And once you've seen it clearly, it stops feeling distant. It starts feeling essential. This is Siberia, and this is what was always there, waiting behind the silence.
Yeah.